The lake always looked different at sunset. Golden light would ripple across the water like molten glass, and the air carried that quiet hum of crickets waking for the night. At the far end of the shoreline, tucked away where pine trees leaned over the water, stood a cabin. It wasn't luxurious or new, but it was strong, clean, and well cared for. To David, it was peace, a place where he could finally breathe. David had worked his entire life to be able to own something like this. Growing up in a noisy city, surrounded by concrete, he used to dream about escaping to a quiet piece of nature. Years of long nights, double shifts, and sacrifice finally brought him here. He hadn't come to flaunt anything, nor to disturb anyone. He came to rest, to think, and to host conversations that mattered. But not everyone in the community saw it that way. The Lakewood Homeowners Association was notorious for its pettiness. On the surface, they claimed to keep order and standards, but beneath that polished language lay something uglier. Many residents had whispered about how the HOA picked on people who were different, how they searched for excuses to make life harder for those they decided didn't belong. And from the day David moved in, they had set their sights on him. First, it was small things. A notice taped to his door about improper garbage disposal, though his cans were neatly aligned. Then a letter saying his boat dock needed to be repainted, though it had been repainted 2 weeks prior. Every knock and letter carried the same unspoken message: "We don't want you here." David noticed it, but he chose not to react. He knew too well how these games worked. People like the HOA thrived when you snapped, when you shouted, when you gave them fuel for their gossip. He wasn't about to hand them that satisfaction. Instead, he kept his focus on his work. Because this wasn't just any ordinary week for David. Tonight, inside that very cabin, he was preparing for a meeting with someone powerful. Papers lay stacked neatly on the wooden dining table. A pot of coffee brewed on the stove, and a lamp cast a warm glow across the room. He adjusted his jacket, checked his watch, and waited. A knock on the door finally came. David opened it, and standing there was a tall woman in a navy suit, her expression calm but commanding. This was Eleanor Blake, the state attorney general. She had chosen David's cabin for privacy, away from the public eye, to discuss a series of reforms concerning housing discrimination and property law. The irony wasn't lost on David. "Thank you for making the trip out here," David said, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you for offering the space," she replied, stepping inside. "It's peaceful, and we'll need that peace tonight. We have a lot to cover." For the next hour, the cabin became a hub of conversation. They went through case studies, examined reports of HOA abuses, and discussed upcoming legislation that could bring accountability to organizations that often acted above the law. Eleanor asked sharp questions. David provided careful answers. It was serious work, the kind of work that could change lives. But while they were inside building solutions, trouble was brewing outside. The HOA board had gathered earlier that evening in one of their kitchens. 4 of them sat around a table littered with wine glasses and documents. Their conversation was not about community improvements or neighborly care. It was about David. "I've had enough of him," muttered Clark, the board president. "He doesn't show up to our meetings. He doesn't answer our letters the way I expect. He thinks he can just buy a cabin and ignore the rules." "He's ignoring us," another board member sneered. "And the longer he stays, the more others will think they can get away with it. He's already bringing down the tone of the place." "What tone?" someone laughed bitterly. "This used to be an exclusive community. Now anyone with money thinks they can walk in." The words hung in the air, heavy and telling. They weren't talking about money. They were talking about race, about prejudice disguised as standards. Finally, Clark slammed his palm against the table. "Enough is enough. We're going down there tonight. He can't keep hiding behind those walls. Let's see what he's really up to. It was reckless. It was illegal. But fueled by arrogance and entitlement, they convinced themselves they had the right. They grabbed their flashlights, printed copies of community bylaws, and marched towards the cabin with a sense of self-righteous authority. Inside, David and Eleanor were deep in conversation when they heard crunch of footsteps on gravel. David's eyes narrowed. He stood, motioning Eleanor to pause. "Expecting anyone else?" she asked quietly. "No," David replied. "Stay here." He opened the door just as 3 beams of flashlight cut across the porch. The HOA board stood there, faces hard, voices sharp. "Good evening," Clark said without courtesy. "We need to inspect your property." David's jaw tightened. "At this hour?" "You've been ignoring our notices," Clark shot back. "We have reason to believe you're violating community codes. We'll need to come in and take a look." Behind them, the others murmured in agreement, their posture aggressive, their presence more like an invading force than a neighborly visit. "This is private property," David said firmly. "You don't have the right to come inside." "Don't lecture us on rights," Clark snapped. "You signed the HOA agreement when you bought this place. That means we decide what's allowed here." David opened his mouth, but before he could, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "Actually," Eleanor said, stepping into the doorway, "that's not how the law works." The HOA froze. For the first time that night, their confidence cracked. Standing before them wasn't just David, the man they had been targeting. It was the state attorney general herself, her badge glinting in the lamplight. Who are you?" one of them stammered. Eleanor met their eyes, unblinking. "Someone you should be very careful about interrupting." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the faint lapping of water against the shore. The HOA members shifted uncomfortably, their arrogance faltering, but pride kept them from retreating. Clark cleared his throat, trying to recover. "We're simply enforcing the rules of our community." "No," Eleanor said sharply, her voice like steel. "What you're doing is harassment. You have no authority to enter this cabin without permission, and you certainly don't have the right to intimidate homeowners based on your own bias." The words hit them like a slap. Suddenly, the ground they had been standing on didn't feel so steady. David folded his arms, his eyes locked on Clark. "You wanted to see what I was doing here tonight. Now you see. The question is, do you understand what that means?" The board members exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. They had stormed down to the cabin expecting to confront a man they thought was powerless. Instead, they had walked straight into a meeting with one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. And the night was far from over.
The air outside the cabin was so heavy you could almost hear the silence pressing down. The HOA board members stood frozen, caught between arrogance and fear. Their flashlights flickered nervously against the wooden porch, the beams no longer symbols of control, but of exposure. Inside the cabin, the warm lamplight spilled onto the Attorney General's face as she stepped forward, her gaze sharp and unyielding. She carried herself with the kind of presence that made people straighten their backs without even realizing it. "You should know," she began evenly, "that barging into someone's private residence without due process is not only unethical, it can be criminal." Clark, the HOA president, forced a tight smile. "Now, hold on just a minute. We're not criminals. We're community leaders. We're here to maintain standards." "Standards," Eleanor repeated, her voice low but firm. "Tell me, Mr. Clark, what standards require you to confront a homeowner after dark with no notice, no warrant, and no legal cause?" Clark's mouth opened, but no words came. One of the other board members shifted uncomfortably, mumbling, "We were just checking on compliance." David, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "Let's call it what it is. This wasn't about compliance. This was about me. From the moment I moved in, you've targeted me with bogus violations and thin excuses. Tonight, you thought you could intimidate me into leaving. That's what this is really about." The board's silence was as loud as a confession. None of them denied it. None of them even looked him in the eye. Eleanor didn't miss a beat. "I've been reviewing case files across the state about discriminatory enforcement by HOAs. Tonight, I just witnessed one firsthand. You might have thought you were exercising authority, but what I see are patterns of harassment, and harassment has consequences." The words landed like thunder. For the first time, real fear flashed across Clark's face. His hands twitched nervously at his side. "Now wait just a second. We didn't know who you were. We were only trying to—" To what? Catch him breaking a rule? Or catch him being himself in a place you don't think he belongs? The tension was unbearable. The other board members shuffled backward, glancing toward the path that led back to their homes, as if to hope to slip away from the storm they'd unleashed. But Clark held his ground, pride shackling him to the spot. David's voice was steady, but filled with emotion. "You know what the real tragedy is? I came here for peace. I bought this cabin because I wanted to build something meaningful, to contribute to this community in my own quiet way. And instead of welcome, all I've gotten from you is suspicion. You never once knocked on my door to say hello. You only came with complaints. And tonight you came with flashlights and threats. That says everything about who you are and nothing about me." The Attorney General turned slightly, her eyes still locked on the HOA board. "You've made it very clear tonight that this community's leadership needs oversight. So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow morning, my office will begin a formal investigation into the practices of this HOA. Every complaint, every violation notice, every fine, you'll hand it over. If there's evidence of discrimination, you'll be held accountable under state law." Clark's face drained of color. That could ruin everything." "Maybe it should," Eleanor replied coldly. "Maybe it's time someone reminded you that power is not a license to abuse." The words seemed to echo in the night. The lake, the trees, the crickets. It was as if the whole world had paused to listen. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one by one, the HOA board members lowered their flashlights. Without another word, they turned and walked back up the path, their once confident strides now clumsy and heavy with dread. Clark lingered for a moment longer, his jaw tight, before finally following them into the shadows. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The porch felt different now, lighter, freer, though the memory of the confrontation lingered like smoke. He turned to Eleanor. "Thank you. If you hadn't been here tonight—" She shook her head. "No, David, you stood your ground. That matters. I was just the mirror showing them what they really are." They stepped back inside the cabin. The papers on the table suddenly seemed heavier, the work they represented even more urgent. Because now it wasn't just about policy or theory. It was personal. It was real. Over the next few hours, they worked with a renewed sense of determination. David provided his own documentation, copies of notices, letters, and every fabricated violation he had received. Eleanor took careful notes, already forming the outline of a case that could shine a light on what had been hidden in darkness for too long. As dawn broke, painting the lake in hues of pink and silver, Eleanor stood to leave. She placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You've been carrying this weight quietly, but after tonight, you won't carry it alone. Change is coming." David nodded, his chest tight with both relief and resolve. Let's make sure it's not just for me. Let's make sure it's for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. In the days that followed, the investigation moved swiftly. Word spread through the community like wildfire. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began stepping forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation by the HOA. Patterns emerged. Patterns of selective enforcement, of targeting individuals who didn't fit the board's narrow image of acceptable. The media caught wind of it. Cameras soon arrived at the lake, capturing the picturesque scenery now overshadowed by scandal. Reporters pressed microphones towards Clark and his fellow board members, who struggled to defend themselves as their arrogance crumbled under public scrutiny. For David, it was surreal. He never wanted the spotlight, never sought attention, but he knew this was bigger than him. When the press asked for a statement, he spoke calmly and clearly. "I didn't come here to fight. I came here to live in peace. But when peace is denied, when dignity is stripped away, then silence becomes complicity. I chose not to stay silent, and now I hope others won't either." His words struck a chord. Across the state, people began sharing their own battles with unfair HOAs, their own stories of discrimination disguised as standards. What began as one man's struggle in a lakeside cabin became a movement calling for change. Weeks later, the state announced new legislation, stricter oversight of HOAs, clearer protections for homeowners, harsher penalties for discriminatory practices. And at the signing of the bill, standing proudly in the front row, was David. Beside him was Eleanor, her presence steady and reassuring. Clark and the other board members were stripped of their positions, fined heavily, and left to face the shame of their actions. The community they once ruled with arrogance now looked at them with disappointment, even disgust. As summer faded into autumn, the cabin by the lake returned to its quiet state. The golden sunsets once again danced across the water, but now they seemed to shine a little brighter, because within those walls a battle had been fought and won. One evening, as David sat on the porch sipping coffee, a neighbor he had never met walked up the path. An older woman, carrying a plate of fresh-baked cookies, smiled nervously. "I should have come sooner," she said, "but I want you to know not all of us agreed with how they treated you. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you stayed." David accepted the plate, warmth rising in his chest. "Thank you," he said simply. And as the crickets began their nightly chorus, David looked out across the water, knowing that peace, true peace, was no longer just a dream. It was something worth standing for. Something worth protecting. Because sometimes the fight for dignity doesn't happen in courtrooms or on television. Sometimes it happens in the quiet of a cabin by a lake, when people who think they hold power learn that justice has a way of finding its way through the dark. And on that night, the HOA had burst into a cabin expecting to intimidate a man they thought was alone. Instead, they discovered a truth that would change everything. He wasn't alone. He had the law on his side. He had the state's top legal authority sitting across his table. And he had the strength of knowing that he belonged exactly where he was.